Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever wondered about the invisible lines of power that define our nation, especially, when disaster strikes or a city faces chaos?
Mm-hmm.
Today, we're diving deep into a really fascinating and, often tense relationship. The balance between federal and state authority and what happens when the president steps in.
It's a critical balance, for sure.
We've gathered a stack of compelling sources for this deep dive, everything from constitutional law articles really digging into presidential intervention to historical accounts of rebellion and crisis and even recent news reports about federal power over Washington, D.C.
A really rich set of materials.
Yeah, and our mission here is to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, helping you understand what's really at stake when the federal government considers taking charge domestically.
Getting past the headlines.
Exactly. And speaking of headlines, recent events have thrust a crucial question right into the spotlight. When does a city's crisis demand a national response?
Right.
These calls for federal intervention in Washington, D.C., they really highlight this urgent debate. The nation's capital, facing these persistent concerns about crime and disorder, it feels like its very future is on the line sometimes. Especially after that high-profile violent attack on a former federal employee. Discussions are now swirling about the president potentially taking direct control.
It's a complex situation, definitely. And some argue, that local governance has struggled, creating an environment they see as unsafe, where even federal workers might be vulnerable.
That's the argument you hear.
Yeah, and they believe strong, decisive action is needed to restore order and protect citizens. They emphasize the federal government's unique responsibility for the nation's capital.
Because it is the capital.
Precisely. But this isn't just about D.C., really. It brings up that fundamental question about when federal leadership should step in, to ensure safety and stability when local authorities seem overwhelmed.
So the big question becomes,
should the president act boldly to enforce law and order, or does that kind of intervention risk upsetting the delicate balance of power our founders envisioned? It's a tough one.
And what's particularly striking here is how different perspectives look at the very same facts. Like, while public concern about D.C. crime is clearly high.
Understandably so, given some incidents.
Right. But official city police reports actually indicate violent crime in Washington, D.C. was down 26% in the first 7 months of 2025 compared to last year.
That's a significant drop.
It is. Yet those high-profile incidents keep fueling calls for federal action. So we'll explore this tension and much more as we trace the history of presidential intervention.
Sounds good.
That whole D.C. situation, it perfectly captures the essence of our deep dive today. That inherent tension between federal authority and state or, D.C.'s case, local power when a crisis hits. Let's delve into that core dynamic now, maybe starting with some classic examples of this clash.
Okay, well, consider the aftermath of a major nuclear disaster simulation back in 2010. There's this story of a cabinet secretary, just frustrated by federalism's limits, who apparently slammed his fist on the table and demanded, why can't we just go in there and tell the governors what to do?
Wow. That frustration really gets to the heart of it, doesn't it?
It really does.
It sounds like a direct echo of Hurricane Katrina in 2005. That disaster just laid bare the exact issue. Some critics even called federalism the legal face of failure.
Oof. Yeah, I remember that coverage. The New York Times called it a fractured division of responsibility that proved disastrous.
And the Washington Post even said it was one of the few real structural weaknesses in our Constitution. At the time, even the Secretary of Homeland Security stated quite clearly that the federal government does not supersede the state and local government.
And you saw that play out right. Louisiana Governor Kathleen Blanco famously refused President Bush's request to federalize, essentially, to take control of the state's National Guard and the New Orleans police.
A real standoff.
Exactly. Congress even tried to respond to this post-Katrina frustration. In 2006, they passed a law basically allowing the president to use armed forces for public order after an actual disaster, epidemic, or terrorist attack. And here's the key part. Without state request or consent.
Oh, I remember that. That didn't go over well, did it?
Not at all. It was met with immediate and, frankly, widespread resistance. All 50 governors opposed it. They called it a presidential power grab.
All 50. That's unified.
Totally unified. Then Arizona Governor Janet Napolitano, who later became Obama's DHS secretary, interestingly argued it would just cause confusion and interfere with states' ability to respond effectively. This strong opposition led to its repeal just 1 year later in 2007.
So, okay, if federalism isn't necessarily the problem, as some initially argued. How should we understand its role in crises? It sounds like it's both a source of frustration and maybe a safeguard.
That's exactly where the perspective starts to shift.
Mhm.
While federalism was initially blamed by some as this grave structural impediment, the argument now, or a strong counter-argument, is that it's not necessarily the problem.
Okay.
Instead, presidents can, and importantly, sometimes must intervene when a state cannot or will not perform those functions. This is what some scholars call the presidential intervention principle.
The presidential intervention principle.
Yeah. The core idea is the president can step in when state and ordinary judicial proceedings cannot or will not maintain order, public safety, or the equitable enforcement of the law against armed opposition, or, crucially, when federal personnel or facilities are in grave danger.
So specific circumstances.
Very specific. And when it's understood this way, federalism isn't necessarily a weakness. It can be a great source of strength and also an important safeguard against, presidential overreach while guaranteeing civil liberties.
That's a powerful principle. Okay, to really grasp the nuances here, maybe we need to go back to the beginning, to how our founders envisioned the president's role, particularly when facing threats from outside our borders.
Absolutely. The constitutional debates back in 1789, they really reveal this tension. On one hand, there was a desire to rely on state militias for defense, partly out of fear of a strong federal executive and a standing army.
The classic fear of tyranny.
Right. But at the same time, the need for a unified federal response against, say, professional foreign armies was obvious. So the compromise was to authorize a national army, but keep the state militias as a kind of check.
And that compromise clearly led to some early friction, didn't it? Like in the War of 1812.
Oh, definitely. You had the governors of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island actually refusing to fully comply with President Madison's call for their militias. They believed the governors, had the right to decide if an invasion truly justified deploying their forces under the Constitution's terms.
Wow. So the governors were essentially saying, we don't think the constitutional trigger has been pulled.
That was their argument. And you had New York militia refusing to cross into Canada, which led to the complete failure of a planned attack on the British. It shows how raw that federal power dynamic was back then.
So how did this get resolved? When did the federal view win out?
Well, the Supreme Court eventually weighed in decisively. In the landmark case, Martin v. Mott in 1827, the court unanimously ruled that the authority to decide whether the exigency has arisen belongs exclusively to the president, and that his decision is conclusive upon all other persons.
Exclusively to the president. That's clear.
Very clear. It affirmed federal primacy over the states when it comes to responding to armed attacks. The president gets to make the call.
Okay, so for external threats, the president has pretty significant authority. But what about internal threats, when the problem isn't a foreign army, but unrest, at home?
Well, the dynamic shifts a bit. There remains a strong constitutional and statutory presumption of state primacy over domestic law enforcement and the provision of public health and safety.
State primacy, meaning the states are generally in charge first.
Exactly. The president cannot simply pound a fist and tell a governor what to do, to echo that earlier frustration, until a state is genuinely proven unable or unwilling to handle a domestic crisis itself.
That makes sense, given the history. Events like Xi's Rebellion back in 1786 really showed the weakness of the old Articles of Confederation in handling domestic unrest. It highlighted the need for a stronger federal government, right?
For sure. It showed the Confederation couldn't check the quarrel between the states, nor a rebellion in any. And then came the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. President Washington's response there set some really key precedents.
Ah, the Whiskey Rebellion. Always a classic.
It is. Washington used the 1792 Militia Act, but he established this idea of a cooperative relationship. States have the first role, the federal government the final role. Consultation and what's called comity mutual respect were seen as critical.
Cooperation, not just command.
Right. And importantly, his intervention did not mean martial law. The rebels were delivered to the civil magistrates, not military commissions. The troops were there to countenance and support, not replace civil officers.
Okay, so support, not supplant.
Exactly. And Washington also showed that the president can constitutionally intervene without a state request if there's armed opposition against the United States itself or its laws, like the Whiskey Rebellion was seen. But typically, you need a state request for insurrections just against the state government under Article 4, Section 4.
That's a crucial distinction. It seems like this balance has always been, contentious. Later on, didn't this idea of the president having inherent authority powers, not explicitly written down, but sort of essential to the office, didn't that become more established?
Yes, absolutely. Several 19th century Supreme Court cases really solidified that idea. They affirmed the president could use federal troops to, say, protect federal personnel or enforce federal law during an emergency, even without specific congressional authorization beforehand. You saw this during big events like the Pullman Railroad strike.
So powers the president just has.
Kind of inherent to the job description, you could say, in certain emergencies. And of course, the Civil War presented the ultimate internal threat. President Lincoln's actions were seen as using both statutory and inherent authority to crush an actual insurrection against the U.S. itself.
The ultimate test.
Right. But even then, during that extreme crisis, limits on military power were still affirmed. The famous Ex parte Milligan case in 1866 clarified that martial rule is limited to the locality of actual war, where the civilian courts are open. Civilian law enforcement should always be preferred if possible.
So even in war, limits remain.
Yes. And later, the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 further empowered the president to intervene when systemic and violent resistance was blocking state or federal laws, depriving people of constitutional rights, and state authorities were unable, fail, or refuse to protect that right.
That sounds like a direct response to Reconstruction challenges.
It absolutely was, and that very law was notably invoked much later by President Eisenhower in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957 to enforce school desegregation against state resistance.
Okay, so we've got this really rich historical tapestry of presidential intervention, both external and internal. How do the modern legal frameworks we operate under today build on or maybe challenge these precedents? Let's start with something called the Posse Comitatus Act, the PCA from 1878.
Right. The PCA is crucial in this discussion. It generally prohibits using the Army or the Air Force as a posse comitatus, basically, as civilian law enforcement, except where it's expressly authorized by the Constitution or Act of Congress.
So a general ban on military policing.
That's the core idea. It reflects those deep historical concerns about soldiers enforcing civilian laws. However, there are important caveats. It does not apply when the National Guard is operating in state status, or what's called Title 32 status. That's federally funded, but still under the governor's command.
Ah, okay. So the Guard can sometimes act domestically under the governor.
Yes. And the PCA itself explicitly allows for constitutional or congressionally authorized exceptions. This includes the president's inherent and statutory authority we just talked about, intervening in cases of invasion, insurrection, rebellion, or armed opposition to federal law or constitutional rights.
So it's a rule, but with significant built-in exceptions tied to those historical powers.
Exactly. It codifies the general rule, but acknowledges the exception.
Okay, that's a lot of nuance. And then there's the Stafford Act. That one comes up a lot with natural disasters, right?
Yes, the Stafford Act is primarily for disaster relief. It authorizes federal assistance, including military aid, but generally not law enforcement functions, for natural disasters and emergencies. Crucially, this aid is typically provided upon a governor's request because state capabilities are overwhelmed.
Governor's request is key there.
Usually, yes. Although the president can unilaterally declare an emergency under the act in specific areas where the United States exercises exclusive or preeminent responsibility and authority, think federal property, maybe after consulting the governor, but these unilateral Stafford declarations are exceedingly rare, only 3 in history, apparently.
Okay, rare but possible. This leads us to the National Emergencies Act, the NEA, from 1976. Now, my understanding is this act was actually intended to put some limits on presidential emergency powers.
That was absolutely the intent. It was passed post-Watergate, post-Vietnam to establish congressional oversight and limit the duration of those presidential emergency declarations. It required the president to specify which statutory powers were being activated and aimed to end previous sort of open-ended emergencies.
So, intended as a check. But has it worked that way?
Well, that's debatable. The NEA suffers from some pretty major flaws, according to critics. Most notably, it suffers from its failure to define the term emergency.
It doesn't define emergency.
No. And it doesn't require that the powers the president invokes actually relate to the specific circumstances causing the emergency declaration. This, critics argue, allows presidents to essentially manufacture emergencies to unlock powers they want.
That sounds like a significant loophole.
It's seen as one. Furthermore, congressional oversight got severely weakened after a Supreme Court ruling, INS v. Chadha, in 1983. That decision invalidated something called the legislative veto, Congress's ability to just block presidential actions without passing a new law subject to veto.
Okay, so how does Congress check an emergency now?
Now, to actually terminate a presidential emergency declaration if the president objects, Congress needs a two-thirds supermajority in both houses to override a veto. In today's partisan environment, that makes congressional checks nearly impossible.
Right, getting two-thirds is a high bar. We saw a prime example of this manufactured emergency idea in 2019, didn't we? With
Yeah.
President Trump's border wall declaration.
That's the textbook example everyone points to now. He declared a national emergency specifically to redirect military funding for a border wall after Congress had repeatedly refused to provide that funding through the normal appropriations process.
So, using the emergency declaration to get around Congress.
That was the accusation from critics, a manufactured emergency designed to circumvent the legislative branch's power of the purse. And while Congress did pass a joint resolution to terminate it,
Trump vetoed it.
he vetoed it, and the House failed to get the two-thirds needed to override. Interestingly, the Trump administration's legal team largely avoided debating in court whether it was a genuine crisis. They argued it was a non-justiciable political question, basically saying courts shouldn't even rule on it because it's a political matter between Congress and the president.
And it seems the courts often do defer to the executive in these types of cases, right?
know.
There's a long history there.
There is a long tradition of judicial deference to the executive's judgment on matters seen as falling within national security, military necessity, foreign affairs, even immigration sometimes. We saw this deference again more recently in cases like Trump v. Hawaii, the travel ban case.
So, challenging these emergency declarations in court is pretty difficult.
It's very difficult, even if the basis for the emergency, as one source put it, barely passes the laugh test. That's why you see proposals for legislative reforms like the Article 1 Act.
What would that do?
Well, it aims to put teeth back into congressional oversight. It would require emergency declarations to automatically expire after, say, 30 days unless Congress explicitly approves them by a simple majority vote, and they'd need annual renewal. It also calls for stricter presidential reporting and, crucially, tries to push for a definition of emergency within the NEA itself to give courts a standard to actually review against.
That sounds like trying to reclaim some power for Congress. Okay, this whole discussion feels especially relevant when we talk about Washington, D.C., given its unique status.
Absolutely. D.C. complicates things because it isn't a state. It's a federal district created by the Constitution specifically to be the seat of the federal government.
Which means residents lack full voting representation in Congress.
Right. One non-voting House delegate, no senators. Now, the 1973 Home Rule Act granted D.C. an elected local government, a mayor and a city council, but Congress kept significant oversight. They can control the budget and even overturn local laws passed by the D.C. Council.
So home rule, but with strings attached. Big string.
Very big strings. And a full federal takeover in D.C. isn't unprecedented. Back in the 1990s, facing soaring crime rates and a financial crisis, President Bill Clinton appointed a 5-member federal control board.
A control board? What did it do?
It primarily oversaw the city's finances, not the police directly, but it was a major federal intervention, and it required an act of Congress to create it. And before Home Rule in 1973, Congress had revoked D.C.'s earlier forms of self-government back in 1874, so there's history there.
But a president also has some direct powers over D.C., even without needing a new act of Congress, right?
Yes, quite a few, actually. The president can mobilize the D.C. National Guard without needing local consent, unlike with state governors. Under the Home Rule Act itself, the president can assume temporary control over the city's police department in an emergency.
Temporary control of the police. That's significant.
It is. Plus, the federal government directly controls huge swaths of land in D.C. Think the National Mall, Lafayette Park, many other areas. And perhaps most importantly, day-to-day, a presidentially appointed U.S. attorney acts as the chief prosecutor for local crimes in D.C., not an elected local DA.
So the administration's priorities can directly influence which local crimes get prosecuted and how aggressively.
Exactly. The U.S. attorney has enormous leverage over local law enforcement priorities. The president can even influence the city's aesthetics through the presidentially appointed Commission of Fine Arts.
Wow. Okay, so these existing powers become very relevant with the recent talk of federal takeover we mentioned earlier.
Extremely relevant. After that violent incident involving a former federal employee, President Trump publicly weighed a possible federal intervention to address youth crime in Washington, D.C. He threatened to take federal control of the city, specifically mentioning bringing in the National Guard maybe very quickly.
And this wasn't entirely new rhetoric from him, was it?
No, President Trump has expressed long-standing disdain for D.C.'s local governance. He's promised before to take over the horribly run capital and clean it up, renovate it, and rebuild our capital city so that it is no longer a nightmare of murder and crime. Strong words.
Very strong words. Yet, as we noted, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser has countered this narrative, stating the city is not experiencing a crime spike, pointing to that 26% drop in violent crime in early 2025 compared to the previous year, and overall crime down 7%, reaching what she called a 30-year low in 2024.
Right, so you have that stark contrast between the rhetoric fueled by high-profile incidents and the official statistics presented by the local government.
What are the political realities here? Could a full federal takeover or revoking home rule actually happen?
Well, a full takeover, like revoking the Home Rule Act entirely, would require congressional action. That would likely face significant political opposition, especially from D.C. residents. Remember, Trump won less than 6.5% of the vote there in 2024, and from Democrats in Congress.
So politically difficult.
Difficult, yes. However, legislating for D.C. is constitutionally easier than imposing federal laws on actual states. Congress has direct authority. This makes D.C. potentially a unique proving ground or target for federal intervention on specific hot-button local issues, things like D.C.'s abortion policies, school curriculums, maybe even local regulations.
Easier to impose federal will there than in, say, Texas or California.
Constitutionally, yes, and this connects directly to broader policy blueprints that have been discussed.
Right. You're talking about Project 2025.
Exactly. That's the roadmap authored by the Heritage Foundation and numerous former Trump administration staffers. It proposes a really radical restructuring of the executive branch and sweeping policy changes across American life.
And how does D.C. fit into that?
Well, many of Project 2025's proposals rely heavily on maximizing executive authority. While some proposals outlined in it have been described by critics as outright unconstitutional, the project aims to institutionalize Trumpism. Specific ideas mentioned include things like mass deportations, attempting to end birthright citizenship, dismantling the asylum system, potentially abusing warrantless surveillance, and influencing classroom discussions. D.C., being directly under federal influence in many ways, could be seen as a place to implement or test some of these approaches more easily.
Okay, so the D.C. situation really is a microcosm of these larger debates about federal power and executive authority.
I think that's fair to say. What's fascinating here, though, is that this tension between federal authority and state or local sovereignty, it isn't really a flaw in our system. It's more like a fundamental feature.
Feature, not a bug.
Kind of, yeah. It's designed, arguably, to protect us, ensuring both collective security when needed, but also preserving individual liberties and local control most of the time.
That's a really vital point to remember. This whole deep dive, it reveals that understanding these historical precedents, the modern legal frameworks, the specific case of D.C., it isn't just about obscure constitutional law. It's about recognizing the powers that genuinely shape our daily lives, from how disasters are managed to how our own cities might be governed.
Right, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, as our nation faces constantly evolving threats, both foreign and domestic, and we hear increasing calls for centralized, decisive action, we're continually challenged to find that delicate balance.
How much power centrally versus locally?
Exactly. How can we ensure that the pursuit of security doesn't inadvertently erode the very liberties that federalism, with all its frustrations, was arguably designed to protect? It really raises an important question for you, the listener, to consider.
So what does this all mean for you? In a world full of complex challenges, how might this unique, often tense historical relationship between the federal government and Washington, D.C., with its specific powers, its limitations, and these ongoing debates over its autonomy, how might that serve as a kind of bellwether, maybe, for these broader constitutional questions facing the entire nation? Something to think about.